This is 5 on 20 News, where the news is distressing and the newscasters are in dire need of a pick-me-up. With Alex Kack.
And Rich Aguirre. It's Monday, April 10th, and we're coming to you live from the creative Tucson studio in downtown Tucson. First, let's talk local headlines.
Mount Lemmon spent the better part of this weekend on fire. 25 acres of the Coronado National Forest began burning Saturday evening in what is being dubbed the shovel fire. Forest Service officials point to high winds as the reason for it spreading so quickly. Winds also contributed to the difficulty in combating the fire, as well as the remoteness of the location. Crews had the fire 25% contained as of this morning, leading to the reopening of the road up to Mount Lemmon. Thanks to the combined forces of 2 helicopters, 5 crews, and 8 fire engines, no deaths or injuries were reported, and no evacuations are expected at this time. Investigators believe the fire was started by humans and not by pyromaniac rattlesnakes nor cigarette-smoking javelinas.
It was another fire last week that spelled bad news for local wildlife. Wildlife Rehabilitation of Northwest Tucson has been operating out of the private home of 86-year-old Janet Miller's home for the past 25 years, where she and her staff of volunteers and vets cared for wounded and abandoned birds and small mammals. That came to an end last weekend when a fire of unknown origin destroyed part of the facility and killed 30 birds. Devastated, Janet and her crew turned to the internet for help. The outpouring of support was immediate and overwhelming. Within 3 days of posting a fundraising campaign on Indiegogo-run site Generosity.com, the Wildlife Rehabilitation of Northwest Tucson had surpassed their modest $10,000 goal. And the donations keep rolling in. As of this morning, the campaign has exceeded $14,000 from 200 donors with no signs of slowing down. WRNT can use every penny to replace food, medical supplies, and equipment destroyed in the fire. Not to mention the reconstruction of the facility that has housed hundreds of animals over the years, as well as the 86-year-old woman who dedicated every waking moment of her life to the care of these animals. If you would like to donate, go to generosity.com and search WRNT.
30-year-old Pima Community College student Mario Moran is one of the subjects of a recently released documentary. When Moran was 18 years old, a gunshot left him paralyzed from the waist down. That life-changing event eventually led to him playing wheelchair basketball on the professional level. The Rebound tells the stories of 3 Miami Heat Wheels players as they set their sights on a National Wheelchair Basketball Association title. After spending the last year on the film festival rounds and taking home a handful of awards, the film will be coming to Tucson tomorrow with a free screening at PCC's West Campus. The event was designed to raise awareness about challenges faced by adaptive athletes and will feature a wheelchair basketball demonstration and an audience discussion with Moran following the screening. You can find out more information and RSVP at reboundthefilm.com/screenings.
The 2018 gubernatorial race is heating up in Arizona as Democrat David Garcia is expected to announce his candidacy sometime this week. The day after Governor Doug Ducey signed a controversial bill expanding the school voucher program, Garcia tweeted, quote, "The governor's disappointing action last night was a threat to all parents and children who choose public schools. This changes everything." Many Democrats are taking this as a clear indication that Garcia will seek nomination, including the Arizona Democratic Party Facebook page, who on Friday posted an announcement claiming Garcia would be challenging Doug Ducey for governor. Garcia is an associate professor at Arizona State University and has served in the Arizona Department of Education. In 2014, Garcia ran for superintendent of public instruction and lost by a small margin to Republican Diane Douglas. Garcia was considering another run at the superintendent seat, but given his party's reaction to his somewhat cryptic tweet, it seems like the decision has been made. Garcia will join fellow Democratic nominee Noah Dyer, who announced his candidacy in February by bragging about his student debt and his penchant for sexting. Few within the party are taking Dyer seriously, so it looks like Garcia will be the man to take on against Big Deuce next year.
Tesla Motors rival Lucid Motors is looking for funding to bring its $700 million factory to Casa Grande. According to the Phoenix Business Journal, Lucid announced their plans last November, which will create about 2,000 jobs. Lucid CEO Peter Rawlinson said that $131 million has already been raised from backers, including the China Environmental Fund, Jeffco Life Science, Mitsui & Company, and Venrock. Rawlinson said the factory will open in 3 phases, with the first phase creating about 10,000 vehicles per year. Their most anticipated vehicle is called the Air. It's an electric car that has a 315-mile range, 1,000 horsepower, and a panoramic sunroof. A base model of the Air will sell for $52,000, with upgrades costing up to $100,000. While it sounds like an ambitious and maybe even unrealistic business model, today it was announced that Tesla Motors took over General Motors as the most valuable car company. So there's clearly a market for upscale electric vehicles. It does remain to be seen if Lucid can compete with the likes of Tesla. And if it goes wrong, the company can always threaten to leave and pick up some easy tax credits from Governor Ducey, who hands out corporate tax breaks like candy these days.
A Phoenix-based organization is pairing military veterans suffering from brain injuries and PTSD with dogs. Soldier's Best Friend customizes the service dog to the particular veteran, according to trainer Karen Long. She says that many of the dogs were taken from local shelters and are trained to reduce the stress from the veteran's conditions. This includes having the dogs wake up by the veteran and helping them with nightmares by licking or pawing at them. The dog will also redirect a veteran's attention when they get stressed out from being in public, a common effect of traumatic brain injury and PTSD. Angel Silva, a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, was one individual who received a dog from Soldier's Best Friend. He said that his dog has helped him with the PTSD because he is used to isolating himself, but now he's more open to being in public. Along with comfort, his dog Lucky helps Angel to remember to take his medication. Angel suffers from short-term memory loss, so he puts Lucky's treatments besides his medication. He says that Lucky points to his medication every day because he wants to get his snack. Angel said that without Lucky, he would likely be treating his PTSD by drinking and shutting himself away, but the dog has made him more social. He also says that he's cut down his drinking because he needs to be able to function in order to give the dog walks and to continue Lucky's training. The veterans and dogs train together for 6 to 9 months for at least 1 hour per day to build a trusting relationship. Karen Long says that about 24 veterans commit suicide per day, and she hopes that the program can help these numbers fall. Long says the program has graduated 160 dog veteran teams so far, with about 100 dogs rescued from shelters. The program was founded by John Burnman, a veterinarian with 34 years of experience. He says that he was inspired to start the program from hearing stories from struggling veterans. To learn more information about the program, check out soldiersbestfriend.org.
And I wanted to take a moment to talk about the program you're watching right now. Here at 5 on 20, we're undertaking a new kind of citizen journalism. We're going to give you the news as we see it, and we want more people to speak up with us. We need writers, hosts, anchors, camera people, sound people, really the whole gamut. The times require a new way of informing ourselves, so join us, do it, and do it now. Email us at info@creativetucson.org to get involved. And if you think there's a story we're missing, a person we should interview, an upcoming event we should cover, or have any news tips for us at all, shoot an email again to info@creativetucson.org. We're here for you, and we want to cover all stories from all points of view, so don't be strangers. And now in national and international headlines.
Oh, bother. This week, President Trump rolled back an Obama-era restriction on hunting hibernating bears in Alaska. House Joint Resolution 69 does more than just letting sleeping bears die. It also lifts restrictions on hunting the creatures by helicopter and using bait to lure them in for an easier kill. Trump is expected to profit from the law due to his stock holdings in various picnic basket insurance firms. Bears aren't the only animals in the crosshairs, though. House Joint Resolution 69 also lifts the ban on denning, which is a nice word for slaughtering entire wolves and coyote families where they sleep. Alaskan Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan defended the new law, calling the Obama-era restrictions a direct attack on states' rights. The measure was introduced by Alaskan Representative Don Young, who concurred with his fellow Alaskan Republicans' stance on states' rights. Quote, "We want to be able to take and manage our fish and game for sustainable yield, and so that our fish and game will be there forever. At least the Republican stance on the environment is consistent. Whether it be clean air, clean water, or living creatures, the best way to sustain it is to remove all obstacles in the way of destroying it as quickly as possible. Don't be surprised when bears lift their hunting restrictions on humans."
It's impeachment time. Unfortunately, it's not the one we've been waiting for. Alabama Governor Robert Bentley's impeachment hearings began today. This comes after the Alabama Ethics Commission released a 131-page report detailing Bentley's alleged affair with former aide Rebecca Mason. The report is real steamy. You could even say a not safe for work read. Some of the highlights include references to locked door meetings between the two in the governor's office, after which Mason would leave with her hair tousled. Mason's multiple overnight stays in Bentley's pool house, and even an incident where the 74-year-old governor had mistakenly answered his hotel room door in his underwear, believing the much younger Mason had come for a visit. The report also cites a recording made of Bentley's half of a sexually explicit phone call with Mason. That recording is available on YouTube if you're into that kind of thing. Bentley is accused of using state funds to hide his affair. Bentley allegedly used the funds to lease a plane to avoid having Mason's name appear on flight manifests and to purchase burner cell phones in an attempt to conceal their sexy text conversations. Governor Bentley has refused to resign amidst the controversy, despite calls from fellow Alabama Republicans to do so. State Representative Corey Harbison has called the scandal, quote, "a terrible black eye for the state." And as we all know, black eyes in Alabama are meant to be shared between a man and his wife and blamed on the clumsiness of a doorknob. On Friday, a lower court blocked the impeachment proceedings, leading to the state's Supreme Court to step in the next day and overturn the ruling. Given the glut of evidence, it is unlikely that Bentley will remain in office for long. And if only we could uncover a recording of President Trump making sexually inappropriate comments.
All eyes are on Georgia's 6th congressional district as we are in a little over a week away from the special election to replace Representative Tom Price. Price resigned from his position to become Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services. Georgia's 6th has been predominantly Republican, with the district backing 8 of the last 9 Republican presidential nominees and electing a Republican representative since 1979, including 10 consecutive terms of a little too-on-the-nose lizard person, Newt Gingrich. But the tide may be turning in the district. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney took the 6th by 23%. Trump barely squeaked by with 1%, or as he calls it, huge, the biggest margin in history of democracy. Given Trump's embarrassing 80 days in office, this may be the Democratic Party's best chance to flip the district. Enter John Ossoff, a 30-year-old investigative filmmaker and former congressional aide. He's a sort of grassroots political outsider Hillary Clinton would sick Debbie Wasserman Schultz on if she were up for the position. Ossoff's campaign has raised $8.3 million thanks to his unapologetic anti-Trump campaign and support from the left-leaning celebrities and Democrats nationwide who are hoping for a little more clout in the House of Representatives. Most recent polls show Ossoff at 43%, almost 3 times as much support as his next leading competitor, Republican Karen Handel. The rules of the special election stipulate that unless a candidate earns more than 50% of the vote, a runoff will be held in June between the 2 leading candidates. The Republican vote is currently split over several Republican candidates, but if it came down to a one-on-one runoff, a unified Republican front could edge out Ossoff. The special election could serve as a strong indicator of Democratic Party chances of flipping over Republican-dominated districts next November.
United Airlines is at the center of another controversy following the forcible removal of a passenger from a flight last evening. United Flight 3411 from Chicago to Louisville was overbooked. That's not surprising due to the fact that all flights on every airline are routinely overbooked because all airlines are run by greed-headed sky tyrants who don't mind inconveniencing customers as long as every seat on every flight is sold at least once. At the gate, passengers were told that 4 people would need to give up their seats to United employees who needed to be in Louisville on Monday. Unfortunately for the airline, all of the passengers also needed to be in Louisville too. Passengers were allowed to board the plane and were then told that the flight would not take off until 4 people offered to stay behind. The announcement was met with crickets. Even an offer of a free hotel stay and $800 wasn't enough to recruit any volunteers to take a flight the next day. Apparently, they'd eaten all the deep dish pizza for one vacation. Finally, a manager came on board and began choosing people at random. The first couple selected left without incident. The second round of eeny, meeny, miny, moe didn't go as smoothly. As the man selected refused to leave the aircraft, the man explained that he was a doctor and he had patients in Louisville he needed to see in the morning. The United manager explained that he had employees who needed to pass out half-sized cans of soda on flights leaving Louisville. The man then threatened to call his lawyer. The United manager decided to defuse the situation by bringing in 3 security officers. What happened next has been blowing up on the internet all day. One of the officers slammed the man's head against an armrest and then drug him screaming and bleeding from the plane. Following the incident, everyone was removed from the plane so they could scrub up the blood. For his trouble, the doctor was allowed to reboard and take the seat that he had already paid for. It doesn't seem like much of a consolation for the traumatic experience he was put through.
The U.S. stepped up aggression towards Russia and North Korea over the weekend, making it more certain that we may never see if the president is impeached, if Russia hacked the election, or how girls will end. In his first interview as National Security Advisor, H.R. McAllister called out Russia for supporting the Assad regime in Syria and said Russia could, quote, be part of the solution. McMaster said that the U.S. relationship with Russia could be, quote, whatever the Russians want it to be. According to the Russian sources, Vladimir Putin wants the relationship to develop further, but he's afraid of being hurt because he's been cheated on before. He is, however, willing to go on a few dates to see how the two vibe together. Also on Sunday, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said that the missile strikes on Friday were just the beginning. She said that, quote, he won't stop there, referring to Trump firing more missiles. She said that the United States will no longer sit aside and is now focused on getting Assad out of power. Russia responded with their own threats after hearing Haley's remarks. According to the independent UK, Russian officials said that they will respond with force if the United States violates any, quote, red lines, although they didn't specify what this would involve. And finally, the United States deployed a warship off the coast of Korean Peninsula in response to missile threats by North Korea. Trump said that the United States is prepared to act alone to deal with North Korea, a North Korean nuclear threat. No word yet on how the United States is going to carry out 15 wars at once, but according to Trump, it'll be tremendous.
The Trump administration is undergoing some growing pains, according to White House sources, and they're not talking about Jared Kushner's struggle with prolonged puberty. Kushner and fellow White House advisor and best argument against drinking scotch for breakfast Steve Bannon are apparently not getting along. The beef stems from Bannon's desire for Trump to carry out his campaign promises, which include the border wall, the immigration crackdown, and a stern response to China's trade policy. This clashes with Kushner's more cosmopolitan, trade-friendly attitudes towards China, along with his more aggressive military stance towards the Middle East. Some inside sources say that Kushner's influence has grown in the past few weeks and contributed to Trump's decision to launch 59 Tomahawk missiles on a Syrian Air Force base last Friday. Reuters reported that Chief of Staff Reince Priebus told the advisor to, quote, stop the palace intrigue and focus on the president's agenda. It didn't help that by that point Bannon began wearing a velvet cape while Kushner sported a vest of armor over his crisp Armani suits. But a White House official said that Kushner and Banner both have agreed to, quote, bury the hatchet and move forward. To prove their newfound forced partnership, the pair have announced a few public appearances in the near future. And next month, they'll present an evening with Kush and Ban, where the duo will try their hand at singing American standards such as Camptown Races and Oh Susanna.
The IRS reports that as many as 100,000 people may have had their personal information compromised through an online tool that makes it easier to complete a FAFSA application. Hackers were able to steal about $30 million from the IRS by posing as 8,000 colleges. When the hackers received tax information from the tool, they then filed fraudulent tax returns and collected the tax refund for each return. This came in the same year that the IRS reported a 400% increase in phishing and malware scams related to tax returns. The data retrieval tool was shut down in March when the IRS detected a possible attack, but didn't make it public until this weekend. They first learned of the data breach last September, but waited until March to shut it down because millions of students depended on the tool. Normally, the tool allows applicants to automatically transfer their IRS information onto the form. When the IRS took the tool away, there was outrage among 17 million FAFSA applicants and their parents because the tax section can be confusing and is the largest reason why applications aren't finished. While you can enter your tax information manually, it takes longer and there is a higher risk for an error. The IRS notified the 100,000 people of the possible data breach via email, which now sits in 100,000 spam folders.
Spanish police arrested a Russian programmer who is accused of being involved in an attempt to hack the 2016 U.S. election. Peter Levashov was arrested on Friday in Barcelona and remains in custody. An unnamed legal source told the BBC that Levashov is being sought for extradition to the U.S., and the request will be decided by Spain's National Criminal Court. The Spanish news website El Confidencial said that Levashov was suspected of hacking that helped Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. Levashov's wife also told Russia Today that her husband was arrested in connection with the election hacking. Hacking expert Brian Krebs has linked Levashov to a Russian spam kingpin who uses the name Peter Severa. While details are unclear about Levashov's involvement, the case hinges around Russian attempts to, quote, undermine the public faith in the U.S. democratic process, according to U.S. intelligence services. Russian hackers were able to obtain emails from the Democratic National Committee, which were released by WikiLeaks soon before the election. So far, there has been no solid evidence connecting Russian President Vladimir Putin, but the FBI investigation continues looking into Russian involvement in the election. If Levashov is extradited to the United States, he is expected to be offered the position of Republican National Committeeman. This was Alex Kack.
And Rich Aguirre for 5 on 20 News.
Next up, 5 on 20 host Andrew Conalog joins us as Andrew explains it all.
Segment is to explain it all about something in Tucson or Arizona or Southwest history and culture. And then you know about it and I know that you know about it and I'm happy and you're happy, hopefully. And today, I know I've mentioned before that there are going to be certain biographies and events that I'm going to fanboy out on. And this one, I might just get it over with. This one might be the most of all because today I'm going to talk about, I would call him my favorite figure in Southwest Arizona history, but favorite doesn't really do it justice because like you have favorite ice cream and favorite movies. But I'm really in awe of this person who is Cochise, the chief of the Chiricahua Apaches, who just led a monumental, fascinating existence. People refer to him as one of the greatest Native Americans in all of history, and I would agree with them if you define Native American as people from America. I think just any Americans, Cochise is right there near the top, basically. And why do I think that? Well, I'll tell you by going over his biography. Now, for his early life, we really don't know much about him, the culture didn't really keep written records or anything. He was a Chiricahua, like I mentioned, a Chiricahua Apache. He was in a particular band called the Chokonen, and the Chiricahua and the Chokonen in particular lived on the borderlands here in the Tucson area, in Sonora, kind of ranged around the 4 states of Arizona, New Mexico, Sonora, and Chihuahua. And for Cochise' individual life, we do know about 2 figures in his life, 2 older male figures that would be very important for who Cochise would eventually become. Now, the first was his father. We don't really know anything about his father. We don't even know his name, unfortunately, except that his father was killed in some kind of trap set by Mexicans from the state of Sonora. And that was not all that uncommon at that time, actually. Earlier, maybe toward the very beginning of Cochise's life, since we don't know exactly when he was born and right beforehand, things had actually been okay between the Spanish and then later the Mexicans, because right at the end of what would be the Spanish colonial period, the Spanish decided that they were going to try a different approach with the Apaches. Now, for the entire time that the Spanish had been there, they and the Apaches, and especially the Chiricahua Apaches, had sort of been eternal enemies, always at war. But toward the end there, the Spanish were trying more peaceful tactics. They kind of wanted to have a more peaceful environment, and they were going for it. But unfortunately for this situation anyway, the Mexican War of Independence happened, and then just with all the chaos of that, there was more violence between the 2 cultures, the Mexicans and the Apaches. And something that became unfortunately fairly common was these traps that they would set. They would have parleys, they would say this was going to be a peaceful interaction, and Apaches would believe it, and then they really wouldn't do that, and they would murder as many as they could. And Cochise's father died in one of these interactions. And that was why Cochise, maybe more even than usual among Chiricahua Apaches, hated Mexicans. And one of his great defining traits of his life was his hatred of Mexicans and his desire to continue this eternal war with people from Mexico. Now, I mentioned there were 2 figures in his life. The other one would come along a little later. It was his father-in-law, a guy named Mangas Coloradas. Now, Mangas was from a different band than Cochise was within the Chiricahua Apaches. The bands were pretty loosely related, and even within the bands, the family groups were pretty loosely related. So it was surprising that Mangas Coloradas was kind of something like a paramount leader of the entire Chiricahua Apache nation. Now, he wasn't exactly. The only person that really in the history, as far as we know, could lay claim to that title was Cochise himself later on. But Mangas Coloradas was a respected warrior and a respected war leader, and basically if there was one preeminent authority within the Chiricahua Apache tribe, it was Mangas Coloradas. And so obviously he took his son-in-law Cochise on a lot of his raids against Mexico, and that was very common at that time under Mangas Coloradas' leadership. And that was where Cochise kind of cut his teeth as a warrior in those early raids with Mangas Coloradas. And that's where he first enters the historical record, as far as we can tell, when an individual was identified as definitely Cochise. And that was when he was on a raid with other Apaches of the town of Fronteras, Sonora, and then he was captured and put in prison. And his Apache brethren were able to free him. They were able to take hostages in the surrounding area and ransom him, basically. But I suppose if there was ever going to be a chance for him to like Mexicans or make peace with them after they killed his dad, it really wasn't going to happen now that he'd been in jail there. And it was in this context for Cochise and the Chiricahua Apaches that the Americans entered the scene. And probably as a result of this eternal war going on, they didn't really mind the Americans so much. I mean, the Americans had been at war with the Mexicans, and for a while anyway, they weren't really doing anything. And so Cochise was apparently fine with the Americans for a while when they first arrived. There's actually a legend that he and his immediate family group had some kind of informal contract to gather wood for the Butterfield Overland Mail stage. So, I mean, you can't be that mad at people if you're gathering wood for them. And it was all fine. I mean, there were some scuffles and things, but it was okay for a while until a particular and very notorious event happened that would be really kind of crucial for the rest of the history of Arizona, really. And that is referred to as the Bascom Affair, or among the Chiricahua Apaches, it's also known as Cut the Tent. Oh, why? Well, I'll tell you. Now, this whole event is so intricate and tangled. I might actually come back to it in another segment at some point, but I'll give you the broad strokes of it. Basically, there was a rancher kind of in the Tucson area. His name was John Ward, and he had a 12-year-old stepson, a bright-eyed little boy, who was captured by Apaches and taken captive. And I'm going to give you the ending of what happened. Not everybody knew this at the time, which explains why what happened, but it was not Cochise's group of people that captured this little boy. It was a different group of Apaches, not even Chiricahua, a completely different group of Apaches. But John Ward, his stepfather, was convinced for whatever reason that it was Cochise. So he went to the local military authorities and said, you know, my stepson has been kidnapped by these Native Americans. I'm positive that it's Cochise. You got to do something about it. And they said, okay, we'll do something about it. So they sent a lieutenant named George Bascom to take care of this. Now, Bascom has been portrayed in history as a villain, as kind of a almost sneering, cackling villain with a mustache and everything like that. I don't think he really was. I think he kind of did the best he could with what he had. I think he was probably kind of arrogant. I mean, he had just graduated from West Point, and this was his first commission, and so he probably wanted to prove himself. But probably not like a fundamentally bad dude, just probably kind of a hot-headed young guy who was doing the best he could. And actually, he found some independent evidence that maybe it was Cochise because he and his soldiers tracked the trail of these Native Americans that had gone from the ranch. And they went in a direction that usually Cochise's group went and these other Apaches usually didn't. Now, for whatever reason, they did on that day, but he didn't know that and he didn't have any reason to believe otherwise. So he, for a variety of reasons, was pretty convinced that it was Cochise that had taken the kid. And so he summoned Cochise basically to come to meet him. And Cochise was fine with that, and he actually had more accurate information about the situation than Bascom did. He just kind of threw gossip between the groups of Apaches, was aware that they had captured this boy. And so what he thought was going to happen, and what he actually was going to offer, was he was going to be the neutral guy and the go-between, and he was going to get this kid back and just kind of try to sort out the whole mess as a mediator. And he went into George Bascom's tent. He was out there on the desert, and that's where they met. He actually brought his family with him, which shows that he didn't think anything bad was going to happen. And he basically offered, like, I'll help you fix this. I'll be your mediator. And George Bascom, just for a variety of reasons, thought Cochise was lying, and he basically said, so, that you're lying, and you have the kid, and you're under arrest now, and so is your family, and gotcha, basically. But not Cochise, because when he figured out what was happening, he took a knife and he cut the tent and like did a sick roll out and just ran off, basically. That's why it's called cut the tent. And I mean, people were shooting at him and he was running off, and probably pretty awesome, honestly. But unfortunately, his family was not fast enough to follow him, and so Bascom took those members of his family as hostages. And then Cochise, in response to that, roamed around the area and scooped up some local Americans and took them hostage. And now, a lot of things happened over the next few days. This all gets pretty intricate. But basically, the end result is that both sets of hostages on both sides ended up dead. And that was it. The die was cast. Obviously now, Cochise was pretty mad. And he basically declared war on America as well as Mexico now. And that was the state of things for about 10 years after that. Now, the first big confrontation was at the Battle of Apache Pass. I mentioned that before in my segment that talked about the California Column, the group of Union soldiers that were coming from California to try to take over the Confederacy in Texas, that whole thing. They fought the Apaches under Cochise and Mangus Coloradas. And that was the biggest battle that took place maybe in the entirety of the Apache Wars. And after that, it was more skirmishes and raids and stuff like that. But the important thing about that one is after that, Mangus Coloradas became convinced that maybe peace was an option even with all this stuff happening. So Mangus Coloradas went into this fort in New Mexico and kind of tried to have a peaceful exchange and see if he could get something figured out. And those guys just killed him. Those American soldiers just murdered Mangus Coloradas. The commander said, or is quoted as saying, basically, we got him, we got to kill him, we just got to do it. And they killed him, and they boiled his head until just his skull was left, and they sent his skull to the Smithsonian Institution. And that, I mean, there's no going back from that one. If Cochise was thinking, well, maybe we can figure something out after you took my family hostage and killed him, I mean, you boiled my father-in-law's head and sent it to a museum. It's on now. And it was. He waged a really intense war on both sides of the border. One guy thinks that as many as 5,000 people were killed in this 10 years. That's probably a little high, but it was definitely several hundred. And if that doesn't sound that high, think of the size of the population at that time. That's a lot of people that Cochise did away with, basically. And it was brutal. And eventually, Cochise basically came to the same conclusion, and he got tired of it after a while. He just was getting older. He was getting ill toward the end of his life. Some people think he had stomach cancer, and he was just kind of getting kind of tired and just was ready for it to be over. Now, there had been efforts to establish peace with Cochise. There was one guy, an interesting guy, who I mention now because he'll become important later, named Tom Jeffords, just a local Arizona dude who kind of took it upon himself for some reason to just go alone to try to find Cochise and convince him to be peaceful. And he did. He found Cochise and was just like, hey, you shouldn't do war anymore. And Cochise was like, no, I'm still going to do war, but you're a cool guy. And they became friends, which is kind of interesting. They just were buddies after that. But Tom Jeffords' effort was kind of in the middle of all the fighting, and Cochise wasn't ready. But then eventually he was. And so that was why he accepted a peace commission, I guess, from an American general named O.O. Howard. Kind of an interesting guy himself. He had lost an arm in the Civil War. He was very strongly Christian, almost a Christian mystic, kind of an eccentric dude. And he, for whatever reason, was liked enough by Cochise to officially establish peace. And so Cochise concluded peace. And one of the conditions was that there was going to be a reservation. But Cochise basically got to pick where it was, and he picked what is in modern Cochise County, which of course Cochise County is named after Cochise. This was called the Chiricahua Reservation. It doesn't exist anymore for reasons I'm going to talk about later. And another thing was that when they were deciding who the Indian agent of the reservation was, the American governmental authority who would run it in that capacity, Cochise said, well, I got a buddy that's named Tom Jeffords, and why not him? And they were like, okay, yeah, why not him? And Tom Jeffords was, yeah, cool, I'll have my job, be hanging out with my friend Cochise. And that's what they did, and that lasted for several years. And the peace that Cochise had concluded with the Chiricahuas and the Americans lasted for as long as he was alive, which was a pretty remarkable testament to how much authority he had over the Chiricahuas, especially because one of the provisions was that the Chiricahuas could no longer raid into Mexico. And Cochise apparently didn't like that very much himself, and definitely his younger warriors wanted to continue doing that. But Cochise was able to keep it all together just because of how much respect everybody had for him. And then eventually, like I said, he probably had some kind of cancer, and he died in his 60s. And he is buried somewhere in Cochise County. People don't know exactly where. And just as an epilogue to this really monumental life, after he died, the cohesiveness and the authority of him and the peace he established broke down, and the Chiricahua returned to war, and the war would last about another 10 years with more violence before it finally came to an end. And that's the story of Cochise, who really is a magnificent, I guess, figure in our history. I mean, lands and areas and cultures like ours, like this border area of Arizona, New Mexico, Sonora, Chihuahua, have histories that we all share no matter what sides of various conflicts our immediate ancestors were on. And Cochise is one of those epic histories for all of us. I mean, I almost think that the story of Cochise is like the Southwestern Borderland Odyssey or something. Just a remarkable figure that I'm talking about now, and I really think just a testament to his strength and his amazingness. If there are people here in this area at any time in future history, they're probably going to be talking about Cochise. And with that in mind, this is Andrew Conlog for Andrew Explains It All. I will see you next time.